Conflict is part of life, be it at home or work or even recreation. How you negotiate conflict has a lot to do with success in all these areas. Matter of fact, research on marriage indicates a strong correlation with successful conflict resolution, i.e., productive fighting, and marital happiness. Today we're going to learn mediation techniques for everyday life, to use these techniques to facilitate conflict resolution. I'm Dick Goldberg, and welcome to Insights. Our guests today, both experts in mediation, are married to each other, so I guess they have a very blissful marriage. They know how to negotiate conflict. With us is Lisa and Harry Webne-Behrman. Both are senior partners in Collaborative Initiatives, Inc. Through this organization, they've helped hundreds of schools, businesses, and nonprofits in building conflict resolution skills in their organizations. Lisa is a senior psychologist at the University of Wisconsin Counseling Center. Harry has penned several manuals in the field, and he's the recipient of the Distinguished Service Award from the Wisconsin Association of Mediators. Thanks, both of you, for being with us. Do you buy what I said in the open, that conflict resolution skills has a lot to do with success in these areas? I mean, that's kind of a throwaway question, but...
Yeah, I think very definitely, Dick. I think that in order to be successful at work, we need to be able to, first of all, identify that conflicts are a normal part of our working relationships, and that to be able to address them in a very clear and consistent manner that is respectful of one another is a really important challenge for organizations.
Okay. When you say it's inevitable, why? I get along with most people I work with.
Well,
I haven't had fights with most.
Yeah, I get along with most of the people I work with too. I think that what naturally arises is that in our work together, we'll have different perspectives on how to best accomplish that work. We might also identify different roles that we need to play in order to serve our customers, and being able to negotiate with one another how best to engage in those roles and how best to deliver those services to our customers is a pretty important thing. And when we do that differently, sometimes we feel threatened. And those threats then contribute to identification of conflict. Now, sometimes we avoid that and we hope it blows over, and in fact, sometimes it does. But what we tend to find is that those smaller incidents then fester. And because they fester, when down the road something else arises, our responses to that something else might be disproportionate because of the earlier issue not being
That's
resolved.
called gunny sacking, isn't it? In therapeutic terms, keeping it all stuffed down, then you blow over someone just looking at you the wrong way.
Sure. And what we know about, at least in our culture, people tend to accommodate quite a bit or avoid conflict. And that's when it does eventually blow up. People can only hold on to that for so long. So what we try to do in our teaching and our work as mediators is create mechanisms for collaboratively problem solving.
Is it personality dependent? Are there some people who are just going to have lots of conflict and some people who really never have conflict?
I think personality plays a role in it. But there are lots of other considerations in terms of how the environment is structured, in terms of procedures in place and different mechanisms that would facilitate more collaborative approaches.
Oh, darn. I thought we were talking about aren't some people just crabs and some aren't.
And it's often presented in that way. I pull back from that a little bit. It feels like blaming the person. I mean, even people who might be maybe a little bit more crabby or a little on edge or a little irritable can do better when there are systems in place for managing conflict, for communicating effectively, for feeling like their needs are being heard as well.
So just to add to that, I think I also agree. I don't think it's as much about personalities as much as we get into entrenched patterns for how we respond to conflict, and those patterns both get learned, and even if they're dysfunctional, we at least know what their consequences are. And then sometimes they get reinforced by our culture or the organization's environment. So if we can create new spaces in which people can experiment with different patterns, such as collaboratively problem solving about these issues, then they can learn how to do those things more effectively.
I'd love to hear bad entrenched patterns that people have. Would you start with the bad?
Well, something that tends to be dysfunctional is when people continuously interrupt one another. And they interrupt either in conversation, or they interrupt by intruding on each other's workspaces, or they're otherwise redirecting and controlling. That kind of interruption is one of those patterns. And often it's met with silence in our culture. We accommodate to it. We then get nice, especially here in the Midwest. We kind of get nice, and then we fester around that, rather than being able to say in a very clear and specific way, I appreciate your point. I want to make sure that I can finish mine, or that I want to finish this project before we talk. Can we set up a time to speak later?
But good listening skills are important, right, in life. My opinion, most people don't have them. So how does that relate to conflict resolution or mediation versus life? Not interrupting people.
I think it is a life skill, and I agree with you that most people don't necessarily exercise those listening skills. I think a lot of times also in conflict, everything is heightened. Emotions are heightened as well. And when people's emotions are heightened, it's harder to step back and listen.
Yes.
We also tend to be more defensive when we're in conflict. It's totally understandable. It's natural. But if it's a paradox of listening. If you want to be heard, if you listen, you can also be heard. But it's the belief that will occur. And I think that's a bit of what we do, even as mediators. We try to create an environment that feels safe so people can hear one another.
Okay. I'd like to start with the bad before we get to the good.
Sure.
So you're saying one thing that creates hostile environments or whatever that doesn't lead to good conflict resolution is interrupting, not being good listening. Listener, what other things are classic in terms of a setup for this?
One thing that I would say is classic is people have different work styles, and they have perhaps different expectations that are not necessarily spoken about how they might approach work or projects. And that is so very natural, but it's not clarified in the beginning. There are no guidelines or expectations as people work together. And then typically what we see in the workplace is as those different styles are implemented, people will avoid saying something, or then they'll think, well, if I accommodate and make up for this other person, they'll certainly catch on that this isn't working, and then they eventually blow. So some things that are just really natural with people, like those different work styles, aren't really talked about, and then sometimes it becomes highly conflictual where people feel they cannot even work together.
How about communication styles?
Sure, and I think there's a real link between, conflict styles. I mean, some of the conflict styles we've already talked about, like avoidance, accommodating, are very much consistent with communication styles, of being passive or aggressive or more assertive.
Define the difference between aggressive and assertive. Just so people know that.
Well, I think a communication style that is more aggressive, or a conflict style, in conflict style terms we'd call it a competitive style, that takes more into account my needs as opposed to your needs. And so that would be an aggressive style too, where I want to make sure my needs are being met and may not be as aware of the needs of other people around me, or even have the belief that in the end the outcome may be more effective, more productive, if I did take into account the needs of everyone, including myself.
So putting together the two things that you were bringing in, listening and then communicating, an assertive communication style tends to be characterized by specificity, clarity, coupled with listening well. So whereas somebody who's using an aggressive style is being more generalizing, maybe conflating the situation, and tends not to be listening very well. So if we can try to help people, and this is where in mediation we really try to model it and then try to encourage it among people in the dispute, if we can try to help people communicate assertively with one another and listen to one another and demonstrate those things to each other, that turns out to be very powerful to them. It's one thing for us to be modeling it, but it's especially powerful if they're able to model it and do it with one another. Then they start to believe that they can be understood, and once they start to believe that, then they demonstrate some listening skills that maybe they possess but they're lying dormant in this situation. And once that happens, then people tend to be pretty smart. They're good problem solvers.
Yeah.
So by having an effective communication environment, people can unleash their problem solving capacities, and then a lot of really good things emerge.
And just one other thing about the listening piece, I think often people feel, especially when they're in conflict, if they demonstrate listening, that it's equated with agreement. And something that we try to demonstrate and encourage and prompt in mediation is that you can demonstrate understanding without agreeing with somebody. And once you demonstrate that understanding, often the other person's defensiveness will diminish, will die down, and they will be more prepared to hear the other person.
So if someone says, our office closes at 5, and that means we're all done at 5, right? And they make their point very strongly because you're a person who likes to work a little late to get things done.
Right.
If you're quiet, how are they going to know you're not buying what they're saying? Mm-hmm. What do you do? I'm asking you.
Okay.
You're being quiet, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, and so you're saying that somebody being silent might convey that I agree with you. Right. Yeah. And so I think one thing that people can routinely do is when they make a statement like that, they can think about, first of all, perhaps I can state it in a more curious way, ask a question, or you can ask for people's opinions.
Well, I'm saying,
overtly.
Lisa, if I say to you, you're the one who stays late all the time.
Oh, I see.
And I'm saying to you, we've got to close this office at 5 o'clock from now on. Because when people work later, it's just unproductive. It makes us look bad. I look bad. So everyone's got to be done at 5 and put their pen down and leave.
Right. And so how might I respond then?
Yeah, you're listening, and I'm thinking you're buying it because I'm overpowering you with my point.
And so in the situation, I think that what could be very helpful is before I put my opinion out there, is I could state what I'm hearing your perspective be, and I could say something like, so Dick, what I'm hearing from you is it's really important to be finished at 5 o'clock. Is that
absolutely? It's got to be that way.
Yeah, and you feel really strongly about it.
Yes, I do.
Okay, I really appreciate that. Yeah, and for me, often when there aren't as many people around at 5 o'clock, I can get a few things done without interruptions. So my preference, while I really appreciate what you're saying, my preference is for me to stay a few minutes late.
How do you think that makes me look? When you're working at 5:20 and the boss walks by and I'm gone.
Yeah, so you're also concerned that if someone stays a little bit later like me and you leave at 5, that it can look
I look like a dog.
Yeah.
I look like I'm, you're making me look bad.
Yeah, right.
So you got to stop that.
Right. And so you want to make sure that it doesn't convey to the boss, Dick's not doing his job.
Yeah.
I can really appreciate that.
That's right.
How might we work it out so both of us can, have our needs met in this situation? Because I really get what you're saying.
Well, maybe you could do your work somewhere else.
That's a possibility. Any other ideas that might... And that's the other thing, people are often, when they get to the point of problem solving, they feel so good that they've gotten to that point that sometimes they're willing to say, yep, of course, Dick, I'll work somewhere else. And and maybe that's really not the best solution. So if we can still keep it slow, breathe, and come up with perhaps a few different ideas, that is often more worthwhile. And sometimes that collaborative idea that meets both of our needs is 9 or 10 down the road. Or sometimes we realize, because we've generated 9 or 10 ideas, it was that first idea that really meets both of our needs.
So I think this point about being ready to generate solutions and being flexible about that is a really important point. I also want to just notice a couple of things that Lisa was doing in response to you. First of all, even if you were being disrespectful and aggressive and interrupting her,
yes,
she maintained a clear and calm demeanor.
How do you do that, Harry? How do you not get upset when people are being rude?
It takes practice, and it also takes some discipline to know what I think we're trying to convey here, which is that if I take a listening stance into that interaction and I demonstrate to you that I'm really trying to listen to you, then as you go blah, blah, blah at me, then I know that my first response to you will be to summarize back what I've heard you say. That way I'm demonstrating to you in a way that might take you a couple of moments, a couple of iterations back and forth, but I'm demonstrating to you that I'm making an effort to understand you. Once I've demonstrated that a couple of times, then I have standing with you to be able to say, Dick, I really want to finish what I'm saying. I'm really trying to hear what you have to say. Now that's an assertive statement then, right?
Yeah.
And you may not be ready to hear that from me at first until I've gained that standing. So by my maintaining a listening stance and by my stating back to you in a synthesizing way the meaning behind what you're saying, we're able to continue the conversation. So then she got to the point where she could say, so how might we work that out?
Let me play devil's advocate. What
Sure.
if they say, I just said that. You're repeating what I just said.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm clear with you.
Okay.
Okay, but I guess I was right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay. And did you have something to add?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that research states that generally when people are in conflict, it takes about 4 times on average for an assertive message to be heard. So I think often when we work with groups on conflict resolution and we practice some of those skills of listening and asserting, people will assert themselves, and then when the response is a defensive response, they'll say, see, it doesn't work. And so it means having to stick with it just a little bit longer and making sure that you're demonstrating that you've really understood the other person, and not in a robotic manner, but in a genuine.
Can you be
manner.
genuine when someone is being kind of offensive and obnoxious toward you? Is it kind of a...
Yeah.
Don't you sound kind of plastic when you just keep saying, I hear what you're saying?
Right. And, the thing is that I think that if somebody is being aggressive and offensive and obnoxious, that you may not be able to engage. I'm not sure I'd want to engage. And so then one needs to step back and be able to say, okay, what do we need in order to have this conversation? Because right now this doesn't feel very good.
And as mediators, really one of the very first things that we're doing in working with people is creating some essentially ground rules, operating agreements for how we're going to have the conversation. And they're common sense in a lot of ways. They're typical things that people tend to do in constructive conversation anyway, such as one person will speak at a time. We'll just try to listen to one another respectfully, try to refrain from name calling, things like that. But then what we're really trying to do, and we're quite transparent with people, say we're trying to establish guidelines for a safe and constructive environment in which to have the conversation. Now, by doing that early and by getting buy-in to those basic ground rules, they become points of reference, both for the parties in the dispute and for us to be able to say, wait a second, we had this agreement earlier about how we were going to have the conversation. And that becomes a way to be able to remind people, and it's not in a blaming way, just to remind them, we intended to try to not interrupt each other, but right now that's difficult. What do you need in order to make sure that you don't interrupt? Sometimes I make sure people have pen and paper so that they can write it down because they're worried about losing that thought, right? Sometimes they feel like because of their communication style that they don't get enough opportunity to say everything fully. Sometimes they're really confused and aggravated by what the other person's saying, and they want to correct that. Whatever it is, if we can understand what they need, then we can figure out, well, how can this space be constructive for meeting that need?
Yeah, and just to emphasize something Harry was talking about, in any kind of relationship or when the conflict occurs, there are lots of different layers of needs. So there's the content, the substantive needs, what brings people to the table, so to speak, but there are also procedural needs, like what is the process that needs to be in place so we can have an effective conversation. So what kind of guidelines do I need so I can know that this won't get obnoxious or aggressive or I'll feel highly offended. There are relational needs of trust and feeling secure in the environment. And I think as mediators, we're considering all those levels of needs. And there are times when you run into some impasse, you get stuck. And often when you're stuck, it means that it's time to shift to a different level of need that probably isn't getting met.
What are some of these rules? You both are mentioning you lay down certain ground rules.
Yeah.
You mentioned the one about listening and not interrupting. What are some of the other ground rules?
Yeah. And so I'll give you examples of some of the ground rules, and I think it's also important to understand how the guidelines or ground rules are established, because they're not just pat ground rules that we come up with. Right. And so what's really critical when we're mediating is that we have opportunities to speak with each party individually and confidentially prior to anybody sitting down at the table, because then we learn about what their needs are, what their substantive needs are, what the procedural, what the relational needs are, and some guidelines and ground rules are developed based on those needs. So there are some basic ones that are probably included in all types of mediations, and then there are some that are very specific to those individuals.
Can we start with the basic?
Yeah, so I think the basics have been, some of them have been identified, that each person listen without interruption, that people make, I usually state that people make a real effort to listen to understand as opposed to quickly respond. Because I think in our culture, at least, we are we're there with quickly responding, but we haven't demonstrated to the other person that we've understood, not necessarily agreed, but we've understood. And to me, that is probably the most powerful. If I've demonstrated, or if I feel like I've been heard, that's like a gift. And you can feel a shift in the conflict when that really happens. We model it as mediators, but when we help the other person do it, that makes a big difference. And then we usually have some guidelines around confidentiality.
Okay.
And the confidentiality includes also its boundaries, understanding really clearly who has a need to know the results of this conversation. And that varies in workplaces and the courts and relationships. There are different kinds of confidentiality, so to be really clear among the parties together, what are the assumptions here, and how are we going to deal with the limits, who has responsibilities to that. The other thing that's important as an understanding, if not a ground rule, is that any agreements are freely reached. There's a self-determination, a voluntariness on the part of anybody involved in mediation to reach those agreements. So there might have been a sense, especially in a workplace environment, I'm sitting down, I didn't really want to do this. My supervisor told me I'd really had to figure out how to work with her. But any agreements that we come to must be ones that we really genuinely buy into.
Okay, so even with your boss, but your boss has more power.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
So power is a really complex variable. We could spend a long time.
It's perceived that the boss has more power. The boss doesn't always feel that.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, right. Well, a lot of times the boss feels stymied or stuck, maybe with an employee that they've had difficulty with for many years. Maybe it's an employee who's been passed on to various bosses, and they don't feel like they're the ones that have most power. Yeah.
And then the complexity of the variable is that, one kind of power is positional power. So I'm a boss, and therefore I have positional power over you. Another kind of power might be power of expertise. The employee may have a whole lot of expertise in the area and is withholding, let's say, the information, and therefore not sharing that expertise.
I take it you're not talking about a private profit-making company where the boss can say you're fired.
Well, actually, it happens in private profit-making companies, etc. Because even in that private company, if I'm your boss, I might say to you, you're fired, but I've lost your expertise, and the company has lost that.
So they need you.
Or there's a ripple effect with other employees, and I don't want to go that route. And I think Harry's alluding to, there are so many different kinds of power. There's also nuisance power. There's status quo power. So, power, there are many aspects of power.
Wow.
Right.
And is it different at all in a nonprofit versus a profit business versus other organizations?
Well, how we measure our return on investment differs in a nonprofit versus a profit, perhaps, but essentially the dynamics are very similar. Just like people make these distinctions often between public agencies and private companies. While there may be different kinds of variables that are used to measure the profit, they're still looking at how are we providing return on investment, time, service, etc. to our customers. So we care very much about serving our customers in either context. There may be different aspects that have to do with the scale of an organization. Mom and pop companies and agencies are pretty different from ones that have a couple dozen or certainly hundreds or thousands of organizations, so they have layers of complexity that way. There may be differences related to collectively bargained agreements or other formalized agreements that are then serving as parameters for what's negotiable and what's not. But otherwise, the dynamics are very similar, and I think that the notion that they apply in one setting or not the other is maybe based on a superficial understanding of that.
Well, I might be not living up to my contract of using mediation techniques in everyday life, but how different is what you're suggesting in organizations versus personal life, marriage?
I mean, I think there's a lot of crossover. Mediation is certainly a specific sort of orderly process, but there are definitely skills of mediation that are quite applicable in everyday life.
This might be unfair to the both of you, and I wasn't planning on doing it. But I want to hear about your fighting in terms of, here you are, two pros in mediation.
Right.
Yeah.
How does this come into your home?
Right. So maybe you ask our kids this question. Right?
Yeah.
Do you want to say?
First of all, I have deep love and respect for my partner, and I think that's really critical. And one of the things that I know is that she loves and respects me. So if we say things to one another that are out of bounds with that, then one of the things that we need to step up on is to be able to reaffirm that love and respect.
Well, wait a minute. If you say that was really annoying and stupid what you just did, then how do you affirm after that?
Well, I think apologies go a long way. I mean, I think it's...
I've learned that.
And we see that at the table, too, in mediation. There are times where people explain how they felt about something, and the other party said, wow, I didn't realize that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Or I did realize that. It was too uncomfortable to say anything.
Right.
But in this setting, I feel I can say, I get that, and I'm sorry about that. Those offerings, those are olive branches that are really important. And I think they're really important in marriages and in any type of relationship.
Well, when you're both mad at each other, if you're both mad at each other and you're having a conflict, who's going to say, I'm sorry first in that kind of situation?
Well, it might not happen in that very moment.
Right.
And like in any conflict, I mean, the first step is to sort of cool off.
At work or at home.
Exactly.
Right.
think about what your needs are.
So in the workplace, if you're getting mad at someone, you say, let's have a cooling off period, just like in marriage?
Yeah, and it may not, and maybe maybe that's articulated. Maybe it's, I'm just thinking practically speaking, maybe it's people take some time apart and then, this happened actually to me at work yesterday. I was very rushed with something, and I thought, I think I could have come across as being on edge. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. Later in the day, I knocked on this person's door, who I feel like I have standing with, and I like her very much. And I just said, I want to check in with you about something. Mm-hmm. And her response was, God, I didn't give it a second thought, which is fine.
Yes.
But it was on my mind, and I wasn't sure, so I thought I would just check in. And I think that's an easy thing to do.
So taking it back just for a moment into the marriage or other significant family relationship, I think people will cross the line. That's part
even both of you.
Normal
definitely.
Life. So we will do things, and then I think the practice is really helpful for being able to notice it and then recognize the importance of it. I think, first of all, lots of us don't practice, and therefore we don't
practice what?
Don't practice really trying to communicate effectively and deal with conflict well with one another.
Mm-hmm. And be really intentionally aware of how we're coming across.
Right. Mm-hmm. So to me, one of the things that happens is being able to notice it. And I notice it in myself, and sometimes I notice it in myself because I see somebody else's response. And then I go, wait a second, Harry, why is this person responding this way? Then being able to ask myself, am I ready to listen? And if I'm not ready to listen, then I may need a cooling off period. But that's different from walking out the door. If I walk out the door, that's actually often a pretty aggressive action. Mm-hmm. But if I'm able to say, wait a second, this is really important. I don't feel like I'm ready to listen right now. I need 5 minutes. Can we talk in 5 minutes? And then I'm checking in with the other person too to see if that's okay.
Yeah.
Then we do that. Lots of times families don't give themselves that time. They don't give themselves the 5 minutes to then be able to bring their best selves into the conversation. And then in the conversation itself, we seek first to understand, then to be understood. Right? I didn't make that up. And when we do that, when we take that listening stance, then we're demonstrating to the other person his or her worthiness of being heard. And sometimes, as Lisa was saying earlier, it's very common for it to need to go back and forth several times before we really feel like we're understanding each other.
Like listening to one person repeating what they're saying.
That's
just like
right.
you said in the beginning of the
Exactly.
program. Yeah.
And that might feel ritualistic to you, and it might feel mechanical, but it's a pretty comfortable set of clothes to be wearing then. And when you're doing that, just taking the clothes analogy for a moment, when you've stepped out here, you're quite exposed. You're feeling very vulnerable, and so being able to just have that ritual is a useful way for people in a very practical, everyday way to be able to understand each other. And then once they've done that, then they can start to bring in some of the problem-solving capacity that Lisa was getting at earlier too, about generating options, etc. And then there's another piece, I think, in everyday life that we tend not to do. We have that conversation, we feel like it's settled, and then we go on. It's useful to check back. Is this working? We said that we were going to do A, B, and C. Are we actually doing it? If not, what's getting in the way? And it's good in the workplace, and it's good in everyday life.
Did you have the last word here, Lisa? Yes, I
No, I'm just. I think that the yin yang, listening and then restating, listening and restating. I mean, we didn't make that up either. That, but Bolton in People Skills, which is a book that's been around forever, but a really well written book on communicating, especially in conflict, talks about sort of that yin yang communication.
Well, this communication is ending. I thank you both for sharing all these interesting ideas that work at home and work at play.
Thanks.
And I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.